Emily Hale had never seen a house so quiet. Not the kind of peaceful quiet that made you breathe easier, but the kind that made your skin prickle like the walls were holding their breath. The Cross estate sat on the cliffs above the Pacific, a fortress of glass and stone that looked like it belonged in a magazine, but felt like it had forgotten how to be a home. She had arrived 2 weeks earlier with a single suitcase and a contract in hand. The rules were simple: no questions, no personal contact, no use of the upper levels unless instructed, never look him in the eye, never speak unless spoken to. And under no circumstance was she allowed near the kitchen after midnight. Emily's job was to maintain the kitchen, the guest rooms, the library, and most importantly, to remain invisible. She had taken the job because it paid 5 times more than any position she had ever had, because her little sister was 1 semester away from dropping out of college if tuition didn't get paid, because sometimes survival meant agreeing to things that felt beneath you and hoping your dignity would catch up later. What she had not expected was to never see the man who owned it all, Damian Cross, billionaire CEO of Crossline Industries, a man made of rumors and shadows. He had not spoken to her directly since the day she arrived. Instructions came via his assistant. Changes in routine were sent by text message through the house system. She had thought maybe he traveled constantly. He was too busy to interact with staff, but that was not the case. Damian was always there. She would catch glimpses of him on the upper landing, walking silently like a ghost. He worked in the study late into the night. The sound of classical piano sometimes drifted through the walls. Once she had heard him shouting in his sleep, only for the house to return to silent seconds later. She never mentioned it. Emily had grown up learning when to speak and when to stay silent. She was not raised in privilege, not surrounded by money or warmth. Her mother had died when Emily was 11. Her father had faded into addiction and anger. And she had raised her younger sister from a couch in a borrowed living room. Her hands knew what it meant to scrub away someone else's mess while keeping her own grief hidden beneath chipped nails and raw knuckles. Yet there was something about this house that unsettled her more than poverty ever had. The stillness, the pristine surfaces, the absence of laughter. Everything about Damian's world was designed to keep people out. But Emily had never been good at staying in her place. She started leaving little touches, folded napkins shaped like a bird beside the breakfast tray, a single sprig of rosemary added to the lamb. She did not know if he noticed until one day she found a handwritten note beside the sink. Bold flavor. Keep it. No signature. Just that. The first crack in the wall. She had reread the note 5 times before hiding it in her pocket. A tiny gesture felt more intimate than if he had spoken to her out loud. It was the beginning of something neither of them acknowledged. She began to hum as she cleaned.
Out loud.
Just enough to fill the space. Sometimes she would feel eyes on her from the staircase above, but when she turned, no one was there. At night, she left out extra water beside his evening glass of scotch. In the morning, the glass would be empty, the water untouched. Still, she refilled it. Rituals meant something even if they were 1-sided. Then came the night that changed everything. It was 1:17 a.m. when Emily heard the faint sound of something breaking. She thought it might have been a dish, maybe the wind through the drafty windows of the mansion. Or maybe, just maybe, it was her imagination playing tricks on her again. But the sound had come from the kitchen. The forbidden territory after midnight. Emily crossed the line quite literally when she tiptoed barefoot across the marble floor. Following the sound, her heart hammered against her ribs as she pushed open the double doors leading to the dimly lit kitchen. She expected to find broken glass, maybe a fallen plate. What she found was him. Damian Cross, cold billionaire, infamous recluse, the man no one truly saw even in daylight, now sitting alone on the kitchen floor. His back against the stainless steel refrigerator, his button-down shirt soaked through with sweat. His right hand was clenched in a fist, blood trickling from between his fingers. And his eyes, those eyes always so unreadable, were wide and stormed with something that made her stomach twist. Fear, not of her, but of himself. Emily froze. Her first instinct was to back away, to pretend she had never seen him like this. Was just the maid after all, one with no voice, no name. and absolutely no permission to witness the unraveling of a man like him. But he looked at her and he did not tell her to leave. He did not curse or threaten or call his assistant to have her fired. He just stared, breath shallow, shoulders trembling, blood still dripping. Forming a red crescent on the pristine white tiles, she walked forward slowly like approaching a wounded animal, then knelt beside him. The expensive fabric of his shirt was damp against her fingertips as she reached toward his injured hand. His voice came out cracked. "No one touches me without asking, ever." Emily met his eyes, and something in her softened, not pity, recognition. She had seen this kind of breaking before, in her father's eyes, during the worst nights, in her own reflection during the hardest years. "Then maybe someone should start asking what you need," she said quietly. She reached for his hand. He flinched, but did not pull away. She gently uncurled his fingers and saw the shard of broken glass lodged near his palm. A whiskey tumbler now lay shattered on the floor beside him. The amber liquid pooled and gleaming under the soft kitchen lights. With slow, steady movements, she removed the shard, her own hand surprisingly calm despite the intimacy of the moment. She wrapped his hand with the cloth from her apron, the white cotton immediately blooming red. "You should be in bed," he said, his voice hollow. "So should you." Silence stretched between them, heavy and fragile. Emily noticed then that his bare feet were trembling slightly against the cold tile, that the sleeves of his shirt were damp with sweat and whiskey, that whatever war he had been fighting in his mind, he had lost. "What did you hear?" he asked finally. "Nothing," she replied, "just the sound of something breaking." She expected him to laugh or scoff or tell her to get out, but instead he whispered, "That was me." The vulnerability in those 3 words hit her harder than any confession. Here was a man who controlled boardrooms and commanded empires, reduced to bleeding on his kitchen floor at past midnight. Admitting to a near stranger that he was the thing that had shattered, she stayed on the floor with him for 5 full minutes. Before standing, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was necessary. Like the quiet after a storm when the air finally clears, she poured water into a glass and left it on the counter within his reach. Then she turned to leave, knowing that whatever had just happened between them could never be spoken of in the light of day. "Miss Hale," he said, using her name for the first time since she had arrived 2 weeks ago. She turned back. "Yes, sir." His eyes lifted to hers again, and this time they were different. Not cold, not distant, but pleading. "We saw too much tonight." She held her breath, waiting for the inevitable dismissal, the end of the job that was saving her sister's future. "Then let me help carry some of it," she said quietly. And just like that, the distance between Billionaire and Maid shrank to something dangerous, something real. That night in the kitchen broke a rule neither of them had spoken aloud. But more than that, it broke the one thing Damian Cross had guarded more fiercely than his empire. God, his silence. The next morning arrived with its usual ritual of pretense. Emily prepared breakfast as always, left it on the designated tray, and went about her cleaning duties. But when she entered the kitchen to clear the dishes, she found something that made her breath catch. Beside the empty plate was a small, leather-bound journal and a note written in his precise handwriting. "Sometimes the breaking is louder than we think. Thank you for listening to the quiet parts too." Emily clutched the note to her chest, understanding that everything between them had irreversibly shifted. The invisible walls of their carefully maintained distance had cracked, and neither of them seemed interested in rebuilding them. It began with the smallest of gestures. A fresh cup of tea waiting near the study door each morning. A second fork placed beside the dinner plate that usually went untouched. Emily never said anything about these additions to her routine, and Damian never acknowledged the changes, but they both knew something fundamental had shifted between them. After that night in the kitchen, the air wasn't just stillness anymore. It pulsed. It noticed. She began to catch him lingering in doorways. Once he passed by the kitchen and paused longer than necessary as she chopped onions, her movements precise and rhythmic. Another time he stood by the large window in the hallway outside the library as she dusted, his eyes not on the ocean beyond the glass, on the way her fingers moved across the spines of the books. He never spoke during these moments, but his silence no longer felt like dismissal. It felt like restraint. Emily knew how to survive around men who held power. She had cleaned their penthouse apartments, their summer homes, their corporate guest rooms. She had heard their laughter echoing from marble hallways and watched them pretend not to see the staff who folded their clothes and polished their silverware. But Damian was different. He didn't pretend she wasn't there, watched quietly, unapologetically. And unlike the others, he didn't touch, not even accidentally. There was something almost reverent in the way he maintained distance, as if he understood that crossing that line would change everything. One afternoon, she slipped. While reaching for a crystal glass on the top shelf of the kitchen cabinet, he appeared from nowhere and caught her elbow to steady her. It was the first time his skin touched hers since that night on the floor. The contact was brief, but her heart thundered for minutes afterward. His eyes had locked onto hers with an intensity that stole her breath, and then just as quickly, he released her and left the room without a word. She told herself not to read into it, told herself that silence didn't mean intimacy, but then came the piano. Late one evening, she passed the open doors of the music room, and the notes hit her like a physical memory. It was not the grand, performance-style playing she'd sometimes heard echoing faintly from behind closed doors. This was hesitant, raw, beautiful in its imperfection. She stood in the hallway and listened, her breath held. And then quietly she found herself humming the melody under her breath. The song was one her mother used to play on a broken keyboard they could never afford to fix. It had no proper name. Just a feeling, emotion that spoke of longing and loss. She didn't realize he had heard her until the music stopped abruptly. Emily turned to go, embarrassed, but his voice called out, low and steady, "Finish it." She froze, then began to hum again, her voice soft and uncertain in the vast space. Damian resumed playing, matching her pitch perfectly, filling in the chords. She had only ever heard in fragments. For the next 3 minutes, neither of them could see each other. But the house filled with a sound that hadn't existed there in years. Connection. When the last note faded, Emily stood in the doorway, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever spell had just been cast. Damian's hands remained on the keys, his head bowed. "My mother used to play that," she whispered. "Mine too," he replied, his voice so quiet she almost missed it. After that night, the silences between them were no longer heavy. They were comfortable, necessary, filled with understanding neither had expected to find. And then he began coming to the kitchen. At first just to pass through, then to linger, then to sit at the marble island while she worked. He would bring his laptop, or so he claimed, and rest it on the counter while she cooked. But Emily noticed how little typing he actually did. Instead, he watched her hands as she chopped vegetables, listened to her quiet humming, breathed in the sense of rosemary and thyme that had never before graced his sterile, perfectly planned meals. One evening, as she stirred a pot of something that smelled like childhood and comfort, he asked, "What are you making?" She looked up with a shy smile. "My mother's stew. Nothing fancy." "Why does it smell like winter?" he asked, and there was something almost childlike in his curiosity. She laughed, a sound that seemed to surprise them both with its naturalness. Because hope always smells like rosemary and broth. He didn't laugh, but he smiled. A real one. And she realized then how rare and precious that smile must be. How many people in his life had never earned the right to see it. The head chef returned the following week and questioned the alterations to the salmon glaze, the unauthorized spices in the soup, the way his carefully planned menus had been abandoned in favor of something far more personal. Damian's response was simple: "I approved it." After that, no one questioned Emily's reign over the kitchen again. She had crossed another invisible line, claimed another piece of territory in his carefully controlled world, and he had let her. But it was on a rainy Thursday evening that everything truly changed. Damian entered the kitchen while she was finishing the dishes, her sleeves rolled up, steam rising from the warm water. He moved closer than he ever had before, close enough that she could smell his cologne, feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Emily," he said, and her name on his lips sounded different than it ever had before. She turned, her hands still dripping, and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. The air between them crackled with possibility. With all the words they had never spoken, all the touches they had never shared. "Yes," she whispered. But before he could answer, the house phone rang, sharp and intrusive, shattering the moment like glass. The spell broke, and Damian stepped back, his mask sliding into place as he answered the call. Emily returned to her, dishes her heart racing, knowing that whatever he had been about to say would change everything between them, and wondering if she was ready for that kind of change. The phone call that had interrupted them belonged to Damian's business partner, Marcus Webb. It brought news that would shatter Emily's world in ways she couldn't yet imagine. "The investigator finished his background check on your staff," Marcus had said, his voice carrying through the speakerphone as Emily pretended to focus on drying dishes. "That new maid of yours has some interesting connections." Emily's blood ran cold. She had been so careful, so meticulous about hiding her past when she applied for this position. The fabricated references, the slightly altered timeline of her employment history, the way she had conveniently omitted certain details about why she had left her last job so suddenly. "Emily Hale isn't her real name," Marcus continued. "It's Emily Hayes. She was fired from the Blackwood estate 6 months ago for alleged theft. A family heirloom went missing the same day she left." The glass slipped from Emily's trembling fingers, shattering against the kitchen floor in an echo of that first night she had found Damian broken and bleeding in this same spot. "I never stole anything," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Damian's eyes found hers across the kitchen, and she saw something die in them. Not anger, but disappointment. Trust crumbling in real time. "The necklace was found in her sister's dorm room," Marcus continued. Oblivious to the destruction his words were causing, sold it to pay tuition, apparently. The family chose not to press charges if she left quietly. "That's not what happened," Emily said louder, desperately. "Mrs. Blackwood had dementia. She was always losing things, giving things away. Sarah found it in a donation bag that Mrs. Blackwood had prepared herself, but no one would listen." But even as she spoke, she could see the walls rebuilding themselves in Damian's expression, brick by brick, until he was once again the cold, unreachable man she had first glimpsed from the staircase. "Get rid of her," Marcus said simply. "Tonight. I'll have security escort her out." "No," Damian said, his voice cutting through the kitchen like a blade. "I'll handle this myself." He hung up the phone, and the silence that followed was deafening. Emily stood among the broken glass, her hands shaking, watching as everything she had built with him crumbled around her feet. "Damian, please," she began. "Mr. Cross," he corrected, his voice arctic. "Pack your things. I want you gone within the hour. You don't understand. I never stole that necklace." Sarah was desperate, yes, but we're not thieves. Mrs. Blackwood was sick, confused. She gave away jewelry all the time. The staff knew it. But when it was something valuable, they always blamed the help. Damian's words were sharp, cutting. "Is that what you were going to say? How convenient?" Emily felt tears burning her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I stayed silent because I needed this job, because sometimes survival means swallowing your pride. But I have never, not once, stolen anything from anyone I've worked for. Yet you lied to me. About your name, about your history. How am I supposed to believe anything you say now?" The question hung between them like a guillotine blade. Emily looked at this man she had begun to know, really know, and realized that trust, once broken, might be impossible to repair. "Because 3 weeks ago you were bleeding on this floor, and I could have walked away," she said quietly. "I could have pretended I never saw you break, but I didn't. Because some things matter more than rules." For a moment. Just a moment. Something flickered in his eyes. But then his assistant appeared in the doorway, having been summoned by some invisible signal, and the moment was lost. "Ms. Chen will escort you to collect your belongings," Damian said formally. "Your final paycheck will be deposited tomorrow." Emily nodded, understanding that the man who had played piano with her in the music room, who had smiled at her jokes about Rosemary and Hope, was gone. The billionaire had returned, and the maid was being dismissed. But as she turned to leave, she couldn't resist one final truth. The necklace Mrs. Blackwood gave away was her grandmother's wedding ring on a chain. She told Sarah it belonged to someone who understood what it meant to love someone you couldn't have. Sarah was going to return it, but Mrs. Blackwood died. That night, the family found it when they were cleaning out her dorm room and assumed the worst. She paused at the doorway, her hand on the frame. Maybe you and I understand that feeling better than we'd like to admit. Bed upstairs, as Emily packed her single suitcase, she could hear the piano playing again, but this time the melody was different. Angry, broken, beautiful. She left the leather journal he had given her on the bed, along with a note of her own. Thank you for showing me that even the most guarded hearts can crack open, if only for a moment. I'm sorry mine came with so many complications. As Ms. Chen's car pulled away from the estate, Emily watched the fortress of glass and stone disappear behind the cliffs, taking with it the closest thing to home she had felt since her mother died. She had no idea that in the music room, Damian had stopped playing and was holding her note, reading it over and over, wondering if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. But by then it was too late. Melly was gone, and the house returned to its suffocating silence, more tomb-like than ever before. 3 weeks passed like a prison sentence. Emily found work at a small diner in town, serving coffee to fishermen and tourists. Her hands chapped from dishwater instead of scented with rosemary. Every night she dreamed of marble floors and piano. Music, waking with her heart racing and her chest tight with loss. Sarah called twice, guilt-ridden and apologetic, but Emily couldn't find it in herself to be angry with her sister. Desperation made people do desperate things. She understood that better than most. What she didn't understand was why. Damian Cross's car was parked outside her tiny apartment complex on a foggy Tuesday morning. Emily's hands trembled as she walked toward the sleek black vehicle, her diner uniform still smelling of bacon grease and coffee grounds. The window rolled down, and there he was, looking as perfectly composed as ever, except for the dark circles under his eyes. "Get in," he said quietly. "Mr. Cross, I get in, Emily, please." The use of her real name, spoken gently instead of like an accusation, made her heart skip. She slid into the passenger seat, acutely aware of the luxury surrounding her, of how far she had fallen in just 3 weeks. They drove in silence toward the coast, and Emily realized he was taking her back to the estate. Her chest tightened with confusion and hope she didn't dare acknowledge. "I had Marcus investigated," Damian said finally as they pulled through the gates. "Turns out he's been embezzling from the company for 2 years, falsifying reports, creating fake background checks to discredit people who might have discovered his schemes." Emily's breath caught. "The investigation about me? Fabricated. All of it. I called the Blackwood family personally." His hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Mrs. Blackwood had Alzheimer's. She did give your sister that necklace, along with several other pieces of jewelry, to various staff members in her final months. The family was grateful to Sarah for trying to return it after their grandmother's death." The car stopped in front of the main entrance, but neither of them moved to get out. "Marcus knew I was getting close to someone," Damian continued, his voice rough. "He saw it as a threat to his control over me, over the company. He fabricated the whole thing to drive you away." Emily turned to face him, seeing the pain etched in every line of his face. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I've spent 3 weeks in that house without your humming, without the smell of real food, without someone who looked at me and saw a person instead of a bank account." He finally met her eyes. "Because I realized that for the first time in my adult life, I had found someone I trusted completely, and I threw it away over lies." "Damian, I love you," he said simply, the words hanging between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. "I love your laugh. I love the way you fold napkins into birds. I love how you hum while you cook. I love that you saw me bleeding on that floor and stayed anyway." Emily felt tears streaming down her face. 3 weeks of heartbreak and longing. Finally finding release? I love you too. I have since the night you let me help you. Since you played piano with me like we were the only two people in the world." He reached across the space between them and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "Come home, Emily, not as my employee, as my equal, as the woman who showed me that walls can be torn down instead of just climbed over." Their kiss was everything their careful distance had forbidden. Desperate and gentle, hungry and reverent. 3 weeks of separation dissolved in a single moment of connection. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Emily rested her forehead against his. "What about the rules?" she whispered. "About staying invisible, maintaining distance." Damian smiled, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "I'm the one who makes the rules in my house. And I'm making a new one. The woman I love is never invisible. Not to me, not to anyone." They walked into the house hand in hand, and Emily felt the suffocating silence lift like fog before sunshine. This wasn't the same house she had left. It was warmer somehow, more alive. "I have something for you," Damian said, leading her to the music room. On the piano bench sat a small velvet box and a thick envelope. Emily opened the envelope first, her eyes widening as she saw the legal documents inside. "This is a deed for the house. Half of everything I own is yours now," he said simply. "Not because I'm trying to buy your forgiveness, but because a home should belong to the people who make it feel like one." The velvet box contained a ring unlike anything she had ever seen. Not a diamond, but a vintage emerald surrounded by small pearls, clearly an antique. "It was my grandmother's," Damian explained. "She was the only person who ever made this house feel like home, until you. She would have loved your humming." Emily slipped the ring onto her finger, marveling at how perfectly it fit, how right it felt. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "Asking you to be my partner in every sense of the word. To help me tear down the walls I built and create something better in their place." She answered by pulling him onto the piano bench beside her and beginning to play the melody her mother had taught her so many years ago. His hands joined hers on the keys, and together they filled the house with music that spoke of second chances, of love that conquered fear, of two broken people becoming whole. 6 months later, Emily Cross stood in the same kitchen where she had first found her husband bleeding and afraid, but now it was filled with laughter as she taught him to make her mother's stew. The formal dining room had been converted into a music room where they played duets every evening. The staff quarters had been transformed into a guest wing for Sarah, who visited every weekend and was studying to become a music teacher. The house on the cliffs was no longer a fortress designed to keep people out. It had become exactly what it was meant to be, a home where love lived, where walls came down instead of going up, where a maid and a billionaire had discovered that the most valuable things in life couldn't be bought, only found in the courage to let someone see you break and trust them to help you heal. As Emily stirred the pot of stew, humming softly while Damian watched from the doorway, with wonder still fresh in his eyes after all these months, she realized that some rules were meant to be broken. Some walls were meant to crumble. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories began with a woman who refused to stay invisible and a man who finally learned to be seen. The end.